what we want to do first is have an overview from Farooq Ullah from the Stakeholder Forum, which has definitely been a leader and facilitator in 20-some years of efforts to advance a more values-based, fair, just, equitable, sustainable form of development. And from Jeff Huffines, who has been working also in the trenches a lot now with herding the cats of NGOs to try and come up with some kind of common framework that we can use to build the civil will to get the political will to make the changes that we want. And so after that, what we'll do is we'll have some time to sort of share how our different organizations actually have been involved in and are trying to influence at this point in time in the next couple of years the outcomes of the Sustainable Development Goal debate and the post-2015 UN Development Agenda. So, Farooq?
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I think, as Rick said, for those of you who don't know, Stakeholder Forum is an international organization whose mission it is to help stakeholders, that is, both civil society and private sector, engage in intergovernmental negotiations on sustainable development, with the idea that the more participatory decision-making we have in this process, the better the outcomes will be, with the idea of course, a fair and just decisions being made that will benefit all of us, not just those who sort of control the decision-making power. With that in mind, this process is actually quite unique at the global level in terms of how it's progressing and the levels of inclusion. So whilst it is very progressive in terms of how much inclusion and how much participation is being allowed for the stakeholder community, there of course is still very much we can do and very much that needs to be done. So in a second I'll try to give you a bit of a background of where we are right now. And actually I'm sharing the stage with Jeff here. So we're a bit of a two-man act, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the process elements, and Jeff is going to go in detail about some of the more content elements of what's going on and sort of where this process and this initiative might have specific interest for those of you in the room. Whilst we fire this up, I guess maybe it's worth just saying as a bit of background, the understanding of how we've gotten here. As you may or may not know, in 2000, governments from around the world came together and agreed on something called the Millennium Declaration, out of which eventually, without getting into too many boring details, came the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which expired in 2015. And so in 2010, member states at one of the MDG summits got together and asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to come up with a new plan for what comes next, essentially called the post-2015 Development Agenda. So they sparked the process to come up with these new goals. At the same time, because governments have the memories of goldfish 2 years later, at Rio Plus 20, one of the major outcomes was to come up with a new set of sustainable development goals. And so essentially now, at that time, we had a two-track process for post-MDGs and SDGs. And that was quite troublesome at the time because it meant a schism between the sort of poverty, anti-poverty development crowd and more of the sort of environmental sustainable development crowd. And there was a risk that we were ending up on a process towards having sort of two sets of global goals, which would have been quite disastrous for all of those, for us who believe that there is no division between people and planet, development and environment, and that we really do need to bring them together, and that of course it is part of our fulfillment of human rights to kind of do sustainable development, have an integration between environment and development. So there was a major step forward on that issue in September. This September just gone at the opening of the General Assembly, where the outcome document of the special event on the MDGs recognized the fact that there is only one process, and these two things have now converged, and we will in truth have one development agenda and one set of global goals, both of which have sustainable development and poverty eradication at their heart. So for us, that was a major political step forward, And now we are in this process of, we are in a singular process towards a singular set of global goals. And so really, I'm just going to take you quickly through some basic points, and then maybe Jeff can say a bit more about what's going on. Starting with the big question we've gotten over the last year and a half is whether Rio Plus 20 was a success or a failure. And I think it's sometimes a bit of a simplistic question. The answer is far more nuanced, and you need to look at sort of the detail and sort of what's happened since. And of course, the real answer is that time will be the truest judge. All Rio really did was start a series of new processes. Ultimately, the big decision making is now. And we need to dig deep and really sort of engage more so than we've ever been to try to push for progressive and ambitious outcomes. However, that being said, we all know that time is not on our side, and we are sitting on a socio-ecological time bomb. And so we do need to actually move quite quickly and get these sort of really progressive outcomes from this whole process. So maybe we can just, thank you. So, Rio Plus 20 success or failure. And that takes us to this very, very complex slide. This is courtesy of our friends from CAFOD. Stakeholder Forum actually has an interactive version on our website, which might be easier to navigate, but you can't actually show it all in one slide because of the fact you get this very dense morass of information. And this is the simplistic version, I promise you. But ultimately, to make things very simple, as I mentioned, everything is coming into a single process, which is what you see at the top, under the green line underneath the UN General Assembly, which culminates in a summit in September 2015, a heads of state, head of government summit, where they will eventually sign off the development agenda and any recommendations from the General Assembly on what the goals should be underpinning that development agenda. So that's the key date to which we're all working. And working backwards from there is where we have to sort of do the planning and figure out how to engage and what the entry points for stakeholders are. Out of Rio Plus 20, as I mentioned, came this one process to come up with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is called the Open Working Group on the SDGs, which is currently meeting right now a few blocks away at the UN headquarters. Tonight is actually a very important meeting. There's a consultation on the next stages of the Open Working Group. So essentially what we're finishing right now, and the reason they're meeting, is the last session in what they're calling the stock-taking phase, which is the input phase, where everyone can kind of come in and say what they want to talk about and talk about what they think the goals should be around 22 thematic topics. And that finishes this week. And tonight's meeting is about how they proceed to the next stage, which is essentially the report drafting stage. And of course, as complicated it is now, this is the easy part. The real bloodbath begins next, when they actually have to go down this process of prioritizing and coming to a small set of goals. So you can see here, this Open Working Group process is this lighter gray line, and they have to finish a report by September 2014, but in truth they'll finish in July because essentially the UN takes the summer off, and that's the last session. So there's not very long to go now. At the same time, the other process coming out of Rio Plus 20 was the Sustainable Development Financing process. So how we pay for whatever the goals will be, which is obviously equally contentious. And that also finishes the same time frames for a report out of the Experts Committee on Financing, which is running right now, also for September 2014. Both of those reports are to the General Assembly. And they will feed into another report, which is the Secretary General's synthesis report on all of the things that have been happening so far, which is due in November 2014. That report essentially will be the basis for the intergovernmental negotiations, which run into the summit at the end, which I mentioned. There's a lot of other things going on here, including some work on governance. Another outcome of Rio Plus 20 was the new platform for sustainable development, something called the High-Level Political Forum, which is met for the first time in September. And this is now meant to be the highest level body in sustainable development, in the UN system for sustainable development. And it has a coordinating oversight body across the UN system to ensure that sustainable development is a coherent agenda for all of the UN. That, at the moment, even though it's met for the first time at the heads of state level, is still quite an empty shell. And it really lacks a lot of definition about what its purpose is, how it will function, and what its architecture is. But that's a very, very important body for all of this work, because essentially it will become the institutional home for any new form of global goals. And so it'll be the place in which stakeholders can actually come together and interact with governments about how the process is going forward and whether or not the goals are truly being met or not. So it's a very, very important body, and we have to get its creation, its design right. So there's a lot of work to do on the governance side as well. So whilst we focus on getting the goals right, the design of the goals, there are some institutional arrangement elements that we shouldn't lose sight of. And running parallel to all of this, of course, as you're probably well aware, is the climate change negotiations in something called the UNFCCC, which is this line here. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was one of the framework agreements coming out of the Rio 92 conference, the original Earth Summit. And that is scheduled for an agreement, a global climate agreement, in November 2015 at the Paris meeting. So in addition to everything that we're doing here in New York, there is this other thing on climate change. And of course, being a sustainable development purist, I think it's very hard to talk meaningfully about sustainable development without including climate change in the discussion. But for political reasons, these things are being kept very separate. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. We need to find a way in which you can meaningfully have a set of goals that meaningfully also addresses climate change, sort of without even mentioning climate change or having a goal on climate change. So this will be a very interesting diplomatic challenge. Speaking to the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the Open Working Group, the Hungarian co-chair, Ambassador Korosi, we were talking the other night about how potentially there is a more elegant solution to this, which is leaving a placeholder on climate change within the SDGs, which could then be filled with some sort of General Assembly resolution. So a 10+1 set of goals in September 2016, so in the future. Underpinning all of this, and including the climate change work, is something that we call the means of implementation, the MOI. And that, of course, picks up the financing aspect, but also covers more deeply issues around measurement and metrics and data. So how do we measure this? Global partnerships, which is a big buzzword at the moment. What new forms of global partnerships do we need to deliver on these goals, including how do governments work with private sector, stakeholders, civil society organizations, deliver on the ground. And of course there's bigger issues of reporting and accountability. So these means of implementation also include things like technological transfer, and that's where actually it gets really, really contentious. And it's a bit about who pays for what and how are we going to arrange all of these things. So the means of implementation will also be something to watch. And I think that it won't be decided in the same time frames. It'll probably run into 2016. But we'll see. No one really knows what's going on there. What really is important is that we have some synergy between these different intergovernmental processes going on right now. And at the moment, it's not well done. I mean, they are literally making this process up as they go along. And there is a risk that many things will be left out. But I think what's important is the SDGs in post-2015 will never cover the totality of sustainable development. By nature, they can't. They're meant to be a small list of easily understood goals. And there will have to be hard decisions being made, where I talk about this bloodbath that's coming. The prioritization of what they're going to have for goals will require certain things to be left off the agenda. But for me, that's okay, because I think what we need to understand is these new goals won't achieve sustainable development in their own right. In 15 years, no matter what the goals are, we won't be at a point of sustainability. Instead, I think we need to see these goals for what they are, which is a very, very important step towards sustainable development and something that can help us spark that transition to sustainability, but not the achievement of sustainable development in itself, which will take a much longer and deeper process.